The anime opens by showing us a massive explosion in the middle of the city of Tokyo. We see that from that day onward, the entire place is covered in rust. A mysterious boy arrives with a man, and we observe a poster of a boy who is being searched for. The man named Inasage tells the boy that the person they are looking for and offering a reward for apparently fills every location in the city with mushrooms. Inasage tries to get the mysterious boy's real name out of him, but the boy refuses to give it. Also, a child who was with them tells him that if he plans to cross the city border, he will only find a desert full of rust. Since from the great explosion that occurred in Japan, a post-apocalyptic era has set in where everything has crumbled. Inasage also makes it known that the place where they are is the last province of Gunma. In a scene change, we can see that one city remains where life is still normal. But despite this, the rust is slowly becoming part of people, since it is not only the city that is rusting. There now exists a rust disease that spreads through people until it kills them, so even the government fumigates to stop it from spreading further. In a parallel scene, we see an old woman named Madame recounting to some girls the time her family died from the rust. However, the girls do not even seem to care about her words. On the other side, we meet a boy named Milo who is a doctor and is currently treating several patients. At that moment, a father arrives with his son to ask for medicine for the rust spreading on their bodies. In a scene change, we see a man wearing a mask arrive at a food stall and sell one of the mushrooms he obtained, since apparently mushrooms in this post-apocalyptic world are considered completely illegal, and for this reason some people are being hunted down for distributing them. Back with Madame, she is recounting that in the middle of the desert she once saw a mushroom keeper who was collecting various rust samples. She also advises the girls, who are companions, not to take mushroom keepers as clients since they could contract the rust disease. At that moment, we see that Milo works at the same establishment where the companions are. Seeing that Milo has finished his workday, one of the girls offers herself to him as a reward. They all begin fighting over him, but Milo declines the offer since his sister is clearly waiting for him at home. Madame at that moment recognizes he is a good boy and tells him he is far too good for everyone in the city. She tells him he should work for the wealthy since he could earn a lot of money, but the boy prefers to keep working for all the people in need. After exchanging a few words, the boy says his goodbyes to everyone. Afterward, Milo arrives at a food stall and orders a lobster to take away since he plans to bring it clearly to his sister. At this moment, Milo asks the man if he has managed to get any mushrooms and the man says yes. Milo says he wants them and begins looking around to make sure no one is watching. The chef also tells him they will soon bring him one that is very hard to come by. The man hands him the mushrooms and tells him to be very careful since if he gets caught the whole city will lose an incredible doctor like him. Finally, Milo pays him and says he will come back another day when they bring a particularly rare mushroom. In a scene change, we see a girl watching the news about a supposed terrorist and mushroom keeper. At that moment, Milo arrives and we discover the girl is named Pawu and is clearly his sister. She is happy to have him back since he returned very late from work. She also apologizes to him since she knows that because of her rust disease, her brother must be worried about her. But Milo, as a good brother, tells her that means nothing to him since he would rather be taking care of her. Right away, Milo heads to a kind of laboratory he clearly has set up in his room where he places the mushrooms the chef gave him in some liquids, and we can notice he has other mushrooms as well. Powell mentions that it is strange the governor gave him the herb synthesizer, since she knows he will be expecting something in return in the future. Milo knows he will probably expect a benefit in exchange, but at the same time knows he will be able to help his sister and other people with the rust disease, since he is trying to create a medicine that directly fights the illness. Back with Inasage, they continue talking about the person being searched for on the posters, and he mentions the person they are looking for has a great talent with mushrooms. Finally, Inasage asks why the mysterious boy is carrying so many things to cross the border, and the mysterious figure tells him they are corpses, leaving him completely stunned. In a scene change, we see a boy in an aircraft launches some missiles at monsters. On the other side, we see Pawu watching the news, which reports that a colony of mushrooms was apparently found in the middle of the desert. The reporter at that moment thinks it is the work of a terrorist named Bisco who has been carrying out mushroom attacks on cities. Milo at that moment tells his sister he has to go out, and the girl tells him to be very careful since they have been saying Bisco is loose somewhere in the city and might have been in the area. The girl tells him Bisco is a criminal who has been causing many problems everywhere. Right after Milo arrives at the chef's place to deliver some things, However, a man who had been watching him passes by and steals his things. A chase begins and suddenly the thief comes at him from above. But upon seeing that Milo has a somewhat feminine appearance, he does not hit him. Milo notices the boy had been bitten by an animal on his eye, and at that moment he clearly treats him. He also tells him that if he keeps having trouble, he can visit the panda clinic where Milo always is and can help him. This makes the boy feel a little bad, and he ends up returning the bag to Milo. After leaving the area, we see the city's governor named Kurakawa arrives accompanied by two men wearing rabbit masks. He seems a bit serious and asks how things have been going with the herb synthesizer he gave him. Milo, slightly nervous, tells him things have been going well and that he must leave soon since his sister is waiting for him. This makes Kurakawa understand he is treating Pau, who is the captain of the guard. The man immediately begins to behave in a very cold manner and tells him all poor people will end up dying from this rust disease, including his sister. So he asks Milo to come work for the government since he could earn a great deal of money. At that moment, someone mysterious fires an arrow which creates an explosion in the city. Back with Inasage, he is a little scared hearing that the mysterious man transports corpses. Inasage asks the child to check that he is really not carrying anything else. But the mysterious boy tells him to be careful since there are many insects that help prevent the bodies from decomposing, and they could clearly bite him. This makes both of them nervous, and they avoid checking and let him cross the border. Finally, Inasage asks why the boy is carrying a bow if monks like them should not carry one. But the boy only tells him there is no prohibition against killing or anything like that. Back in the city, we see a gigantic mushroom has appeared in the middle of the city. We also see a mysterious boy firing arrows which cause mushrooms to grow. At that moment, the city guards begin shooting at him, but the boy is much faster and manages to dodge and counter with arrows. At that moment, the boy appears in front of Milo, and we can notice he carries the same bow as the mysterious boy who was talking with Inasage. We are then shown the boy's face, and he creates a gigantic mushroom in front of Milo, leaving him stunned. On the other side, Pau begins to get ready upon seeing the city is being attacked. Her brother arrives at that moment and asks her not to go fight since her disease is spreading and is very close to reaching her heart. Both enter a sibling argument over who should not go out, but the girl knocks him out with a punch so she can leave. After a long while, Milo wakes up and examines the new mushrooms he was given. Suddenly, the mysterious figure appears behind him, and we come to know him as Bisco, who is the protagonist of our story. Milo is stunned to find himself face to face with the person behind all the city attacks. We then return to a few days earlier when Bisco was crossing the border, and we follow up on the moment when he was asked for proof of his religion since they thought he was a monk. However, the protagonist refused, and Inasage at that moment knew he was someone else. So he made a signal to the child, and suddenly the man fired, making the disguise that covered his identity fall apart. The protagonist, very angry, fired an arrow that hit one of the machines and began growing mushrooms. So at that moment, both realized they had the person from the posters in front of them. And just at that moment, the place ended up exploding from Bisco's mushrooms. Back in the present, the protagonist tells Milo the mushroom he has is much better if eaten directly. Milo is not very happy since he knows the protagonist is doing something illegal. However, Bisco makes it known he equally knows Milo makes mixtures with mushrooms. Suddenly, Milo notices the presence of an old man named Jabai who is wounded, and the boy, as a good doctor, tells the protagonist he must treat the wound. So the protagonist hands him a mushroom, and he immediately begins preparing a medicine. And at that instant, the guards fire at the protagonist, and he warns them he has the doctor as a hostage, so they immediately stop the attacks. Or at least that is what he thought, since right at that moment, they receive a burst of machine gun fire. Bisco tells Milo it seems he is not as famous as he thought since the guards did not care about shooting him either. So at that moment, the protagonist launched arrows to make mushrooms grow on the building. On the other side, we return again to the moment Inasage discovered them. Right from the cargo cart, the protagonist was carrying Jabai came out riding a giant crab. Also, Inasage released some hippos which had missiles on their backs, so they began running at great speed while taking out several of the enemies. Back in the present, we see the protagonist took both of them and began jumping across buildings. Also, Milo was stunned to see his home and clinic completely destroyed. At that moment, mushrooms are thrown into the city to distract the helicopters that were looking for them. On the other side, we see Pau arrives with several soldiers who give her a report. They mention the protagonist was heading toward the government building. At that moment, Another soldier arrives and tells her that the governor's bodyguards have already surrounded the building, and comes to inform them they are no longer needed since when they arrived the bodyguards were already facing the protagonist. This makes Pau wonder what Kurikawa is plotting. We then return to the protagonist's memory, where we see he managed to escape since after several seconds, a gigantic mushroom grew which allowed them to cross the border wall, leaving Inasage and the child completely stunned. Back in the present, a girl named Tirol speaks with the governor and apologizes since the protagonist escaped them. However, she tells him she is sure she eliminated the old man. She also mentions that even though the protagonist only has a bow, he has considerable accuracy and never misses an attack. The governor, upon hearing he is heading to another area, asks them to eliminate him before the guards under Pau's command clearly capture him. He also explains they must split up at that moment and even asks them to search the lower districts. On the other side, the governor asks the girl to go to the lower districts. She refuses at first, but the man threatens her, and the governor finally thinks the protagonist ruined their entire plan since they had a festival in the city. In a scene change, we see the memory of when Jabai and the protagonist had escaped. Both were preparing dinner and realized the guards had stopped chasing them. Also at that moment, we see the old man had the rust disease since the protagonist gives him an injection and delivers the bad news that the disease has already reached his lungs. So they begin talking while eating, and the protagonist tells him normal mushrooms no longer work for him, so they will have to find the rust-eater mushroom. The old man changes the subject and tells him he will teach him everything he knows in this life. This is because he knows the protagonist is one of the best mushroom keepers he has ever known. The old man wants to say a few words in case he dies, but the protagonist gets angry at that moment since he knows they will find a cure so he does not die from the disease. The man tries to say a few things, but the protagonist, very indignantly listening to him, says he will die from it and walks off furiously. Jabai only thinks he hopes that when he dies the protagonist will be able to find someone to continue and find the cure. Shortly afterward, the protagonist arrives with the crab that carries them, and right away we see the scene where someone had launched a missile from the aircraft. However, the protagonist with his arrow managed to stop the attack. This caused the aircraft, which appears to be partly a giant snail, to spit a kind of acid. At that moment, Jabai arrives and thinks it is not a guard aircraft, so he wonders why on earth they are attacking them. Just at that moment, the aircraft began firing at them, and it was at that moment they managed to wound the old man. So the protagonist, furious, launched an arrow that brought the aircraft down. He then mounted the old man on the crab to find a doctor who could save him. Back in the present, we see the protagonist and Milo are in some sewers. Milo gives Jabai the bad news that he received a total of 6 bullet wounds. However, he is amazed that despite being badly wounded, the old man is still breathing normally, so he will have to operate on him right now. The protagonist says if that is the case, he will go outside to draw them far away from them. Milo objects to this since the protagonist is slightly wounded and wants to treat him. Both enter a discussion since the protagonist only wants Milo to treat Jabai. This leads the protagonist to end up accepting, and Milo sews up his wounds. The boy is glad to know the protagonist did not even feel a bit of pain. So Bisco tells him he will go now, and Milo tells him if he gets wounded he must come back immediately. Finally, the protagonist thanks him for helping both of them. On the other side, we see Pau is informed that all of the protagonist's trail was a trap since he is actually in the east side of the city fighting the rabbits, clearly referring to the governor's bodyguard group. It is even mentioned that not even being so many rabbits can they finish him off at that moment. To make her even more worried, they confirm that her brother's building was destroyed by one of the mushrooms. This leads her to order them to the area, and she immediately heads there first. In a scene change, we see the protagonist manage to finish off all the rabbits. Also, the protagonist kicks the masked girl with his foot, and we see she is Tirol. He mentions they were forced by the governor, and she was completely against this since she does not truly consider him a villain. Just at that moment, they are interrupted when Pau arrives at full speed. This causes the girl to get off her motorcycle and launch herself, landing a hit on the protagonist. But he defends himself by firing an arrow she barely manages to block, so both prepare to continue fighting. Right away, we see a mushroom alert is broadcast throughout the entire city, asking people not to go outside and not to breathe the spores. So several of the girls watching the gigantic mushroom think it is quite large and even surpasses the size of the buildings. At that moment, a man arrives and tells the girls that they destroyed the panda clinic, so Madame comes out very worried, hoping Milo is all right. In a scene change, we see Milo gives Jabai some artificial blood and talks to him at that moment. He tells him he knows he only has 1 month to live. Jabai is surprised to hear the protagonist went out to create a distraction outside. Also, the boy asks what relationship he has with the protagonist. Jabai tells him he can consider him something like a teacher since he managed to teach Bisco everything he knows. Back with the protagonist, Pau asks where he learned to wield his staff the way he does. And just at that moment, the girl introduces herself as captain of the Imahama Watch. She tells him to surrender or she will end up giving him a beating, so the protagonist refuses and right away the girl begins attacking him. After blocking several attacks, the protagonist thinks that even though she is being consumed by her rust disease, she fights very well. The girl gets angry and tells him she will not allow him to keep spreading the rust, but the protagonist tells her none of his mushrooms do this. On the other side, Jabai confesses to the boy that the protagonist's only purpose is to stop the rust. Milo at that moment says he knows the rust wind was responsible for wiping out many species and people. Milo says a few things, and Jabai confirms his theory is correct, explaining that mushrooms and some living beings take advantage of rust as if it were a benefit. Back with the protagonist, the girl is very upset and replies she does not believe his words or that they are correct, since if the protagonist were truly looking for a cure to stop the rust, he would have saved Japan. But the protagonist replies that unfortunately, they have not been able to because of people like her who get in the way to stop them. Jabai on the other side tells the boy that mushroom keepers place mushrooms in the areas where there is the most rust since this way they reduce its spread. However, it takes time to purify the area, and it is because of this time lag that people have a bad perception of mushrooms. Jabai also tells him that there are equally people who treat mushrooms like a business. In a parallel scene, we see the governor spying on the watchmen. He mentions his plan failed and Kurikawa hopes they kill the girl. Back with the protagonist, since the girl refuses to listen, he throws her motorcycle at her, but it comes back at him with a hit. It strikes the protagonist, and Bisco only tells her he plants mushrooms in the areas with the most rust, so they should be grateful instead of treating him like a criminal. The girl tells him she knows mushroom keepers only want to create chaos, but the protagonist replies they are actually searching for the rust eater. On the other side, Jabai was explaining this very thing to the boy, since mushroom keepers know it is a completely miraculous medicine born from the prayer of a dying hero. It is also a mushroom that eliminates both metallic rust and the disease in a person. On the other side, the protagonist explains this to the girl, and she still stubbornly keeps believing the protagonist is a liar. Bisco tells her he has no intention of harming or doing anything against their city. Suddenly, the protagonist tells her he met a doctor in the city and mentions Milo's surname since the protagonist finds his face very familiar. The girl is completely stunned and asks what he has done to her brother, so the protagonist sees an opportune moment to take advantage of all this. Back to the memory of when the protagonist and Jabai jumped the wall, we see the child was amazed to see they even managed to plant a mushroom in the dead land. But Anasage, badly informed, mentions he should remember that mushrooms spread rust. The protagonist at that moment was on the other side and shouted at them to put fertilizer on the mushroom twice a week since it absorbs rust. But as expected, the man did not believe him and even ended up shooting at them, so they ran off. Back in the present, Jabai explains to Milo that in a place called Akita, there is a monster nest called Weeping Child Ravine. The old man mentions they tried to plant a mushroom keeper there, and right then a very special mushroom was born. But just as he was about to tell him more, the old man began feeling very ill. Back with the protagonist, Pau launched herself to attack, but he managed to protect himself with his mushrooms. Also, the protagonist gives her a kick that sends her through the air and finishes with his arrows, making the girl faint and fall into his arms. Afterward, the protagonist returns right to the entrance of the sewers and is threatened by someone. But right after placing the girl on the ground, he realizes it is none other than Jabai himself, since the old man managed to make a miraculous recovery. The protagonist, frustrated, tells him if he is not going to finally die, he should at least stop giving him these frights. Jabai tells him it was all thanks to the incredible job Milo did. The protagonist gets very happy and tells him that mushroom keepers always return favors, so if someday he needs anything, he can ask for whatever he wants. At that moment, Jabai sees his sister lying on the ground and is surprised to learn the protagonist defeated her in combat. But Bisco only tells him he used a mushroom on his arrow to subdue her. Also at that moment, the protagonist asks the old man to give him one of his injections to slow down the rust spreading through his body. Finally, Jabai tells him the watchmen are very close and that he will distract them. The protagonist does not seem to agree, and when the old man tells him to take the boy since he had told him everything about the rust-eater mushroom. However, the protagonist thinks how the boy would not last at all outside the walls. Milo tells him he does not care about dying if he can save the only family he has left. Just then Jabai tells him he can see watchmen in the distance and the protagonist has no choice but to accept taking Milo along and tells him they will be companions, so if one dies the other will too. Just at that moment the watchmen arrive but Jabai distracts them. Also, the protagonist tells Milo that if they leave he will possibly never see his sister again. The boy finally says goodbye to his sister, and the protagonist urges him on since they will clearly be caught if they do not go. Right after both boys head to the north wing of the wall, and we see there are some guards watching the place. Jabai arrives just in time to block the path of some watchmen on horseback, and seeing they are only facing those in front of them, the protagonist fires an arrow to the ground, which grows a gigantic mushroom that launches them outside the wall. A few hours later, we see both have walked a great deal and feel very tired. Also, they are no longer being followed. Milo seems a little confused since he tells the protagonist they are going off course, but Bisco tells him he knows perfectly well where they are going. The protagonist gets furious and asks him to just be quiet for once since he does not stop talking for a single second. After a long while, we see they arrive at a completely green place, which leaves Milo fascinated, and the protagonist immediately scolds him saying they are not here on a tourist trip or anything like that since they must find the rust-eater to save his sister and Jabai. Afterward, we see that just as they were about to continue, Milo ended up fainting, and a while later the protagonist brings two lizards since Milo was very weak. After frying them, the protagonist tells Milo he must eat them since their innards look terrible. After eating, Milo tells him they must hurry since his sister has approximately 3 months to live and Jabai has 1. And since Akita is very far away, the protagonist tells him he has a plan since they will go through the Aso coal mines. So after walking a bit, the boy tells him the mines have some very ferocious monsters. But at that moment, the protagonist finds his friend and immediately calls out to him. Right after we see the crab emerge from the ground, and Milo is very astonished. The protagonist explains it is a Gasami Fario crab named Akutagawa. Right away Milo climbs onto the crab and gets excited at that moment. But Akutagawa mocks him and throws him to the floor, making even the protagonist laugh at that instant since he mentions the crab hates doctors. Also, the protagonist hands the boy a suit, and he takes on a very similar appearance to Bisco. Milo begins talking to the crab and tells him he is now the protagonist's companion, so he tries to befriend the crab, and when he tries to climb on it again, it throws him off. So over the next several hours, the boy had to walk. However, he did not give up and over a long while tried to mount it, and ended up on the ground every single time. Later that night, while both rest, the protagonist tells him they need more time to get along, so he asks for some advice on how to do so. And the next day, while the protagonist cooks, we see Milo is riding the crab at full speed. However, just at that moment, they spot a girl in the distance and she brakes immediately. Milo falls to the ground, and we see the girl approaches him, and it is none other than Tyrol, who is surprised to see the boy riding a crab. The protagonist probably observes the girl is controlling the crab, and fires an arrow that sends her flying, and right away Akutagawa comes to the protagonist and Bisco gets upset with the boy, so he asks him to keep training the next day. Suddenly, we see Milo knows the crab is a little wounded, so he gives it a couple of orders. Unexpectedly, the crab begins following his orders, and the protagonist is astonished by this since he does not understand how Milo cannot ride it but can make it listen. And after a long time, we see Akutagawa finally allowed the boy to ride him. At that moment, they spot what looks like a temple in the distance, so the protagonist thinks to rest there. However, when they arrive, they find Tyrol there, and she is behaving very strangely. So the boy immediately realizes the girl has something wrong, and he gives her air through his mouth, and suddenly a worm comes out of her stomach. The protagonist is stunned to see it was an inflated silkworm, and Milo mentions that prisoners were given eggs and kept from hatching through medicine. Tyrol at that moment mentions that guards like her take many medicines the governor gave them, and now she understands everything. Also, the girl is surprised to see the protagonist is there and thinks he is someone dangerous based on the posters, but the protagonist tells her she should thank the boy. Tyrol suddenly agrees and tries to seduce Milo, but the protagonist says no one will notice her, making the girl angry as she tells him he is a virgin. This makes the protagonist furious, and just as he was about to grab his weapon, Milo immediately calmed him down. Then both boys tell her she should negotiate since they want the food the girl has. She pulls out a lot of what she had in her bag and says it is time to negotiate. But the girl brings products the protagonist had never tried in his life since being a mushroom keeper, he does not have much money. Milo ends up buying some biscuits that share the same name as the protagonist. And Bisco, after trying them, mentions he thought they would taste very different since the name Bisco means strength. And upon trying them and finding they are soft with a lot of flavor, he changes his opinion. On the other side, we see Tyrol had some fuel which she threw away, since it is not necessary if they were traveling by crab. However, at midnight, we see the protagonist wakes up abruptly, and we find Milo running at full speed since the place they were in was the shell of a gigantic crab. The protagonist, who is on top of the monster, tells Milo it is a boracarbon yeu, and the reason it woke up was the fuel the girl threw away. Also, the protagonist asks him to stop it by hitting its brain, since if they reach the mines the place will end up exploding. The boy concentrates, and we see that suddenly something falls from the sky causing an impact against the monster, so the protagonist can finally fire an arrow which grows many mushrooms inside the monster. After defeating it, Milo is amazed by all the risks mushroom keepers face. Right in front of them is the mine entrance, but we see a shot was fired and hit the entire area, creating an explosion in the mine. The protagonist laments this and thinks they must find another path. The next day, the protagonist wakes up and Milo tells him the girl has left and taken the money, but in exchange left several things behind, so we can say the girl forcibly sold several of her products to them. Also, the protagonist notices the boy can now ride Akutagawa very easily. Over the next several hours, both continued until they managed to reach an area where they spotted a watermelon. However, suddenly a child appeared and ran off with it. The protagonist immediately chased him until he could catch him, but was greatly surprised when someone shot at him. We can see several children are there with weapons pointing at them. In a scene change, we see Pau arrives at a city that appears completely abandoned. However, while investigating, she heard a group of someone calling for help. Back with the protagonist, several children begin threatening him, and the protagonist tells them he is only passing through since they are actually heading to Akita. The protagonist also tells them they need food and have money to pay, but the child he is speaking with does not believe anything he says, and the protagonist gets upset. So he pulls out his ace and shows the boy his wanted poster, and adds that if they take him to the governor, he will pay them 80 coins. Afterward, we see they tied the protagonist's hands, and he tells them they will give him food before taking him to Kurakawa. They arrive at a city called the Iron Man City, and we see there is a gigantic statue at the location. Also, we can notice that only armed children live in the city. They immediately split up since they will take the protagonist to the upper part of the statue where he will be locked up, so Milo stays with a girl at that moment. In a parallel scene, we see Pau notices someone falling from a building, and a monster is about to finish off two people, so she immediately arrives and defeats the spider monster. The men thank her greatly and invite the girl to eat at their home. Back with Milo, a little girl named Plum gives him food and the boy is delighted. Milo asks if any adults live with them, but she replies no since the adults were summoned by Kurakawa to earn money. The girl also mentions they are attacked by something every winter, and that is clearly why they are armed. Finally, the girl thinks she has rust on her hand, but Milo looks at it and tells her it is nothing like that. Back with Pau, the man mentions they are the only ones living in this place since a long time ago a mushroom keeper arrived and was curing people with his medicine. However, one day many of the people who had been treated by him died at that moment, so the rest of the survivors decided never to return to that city. Also, both talked with the man once, and he told them it had been a quite useful experiment. Pau at that moment gets furious since she thinks mushroom keepers spread the disease. Finally, both men tell her they have faith in rebuilding a place again. Back with the protagonist, he is delighted by the food the children gave him. Also, Bisco notices some harpoons, and one of the children named Nuts tells him they belong to his father, who was the best fisherman their village had. But his father opposed the army city of Imahama, and they ended up clearly killing him. The protagonist at that moment, in a very mocking way, tells him he should give it to him since for a runt like him, it is useless. This makes Nuts furious, and he points his weapon at Bisco. Back with Pau, we see she clearly goes out to investigate the area a bit, and is stunned to find a secret place since it holds several corpses with a television turned on in front of them. On the other side, the man comments that the girl drank all the tea they gave her, so he plans to kill her since she is now poisoned. At that moment, something appears and tells them there is something strange about all this. So upon seeing what they discovered, they try to attack thinking the girl is weak from the poisoning, but are surprised when she tells them she never drank anything and knew they are both bandits. Unexpectedly, we see a kind of monster that appeared at that moment, and after spitting a kind of breath, an explosion is created in the place, forcing the girl to get out. But these men say some words that surprise Pau, and right away the entire place explodes, leaving the girl stunned. Back with the children, we see them tell Nuts that Milo has cured them, so he asks his companion to stay watching the protagonist. The protagonist observes the boy looking at a map and tells him he and his master traveled through many places. The boy is fascinated to learn the protagonist is a mushroom keeper, since a former mushroom keeper had saved him when he was dying. So since they owed mushroom keepers a favor, he ended up giving him the map. Also, since the boy needed to use the bathroom, he ended up leaving the place, which allowed the protagonist to free himself very easily. On the other side, we see Nuts looking at his face, while Milo mentions he does not have the rust disease since all of them had some marks that made him think they were sick. Also, Milo gives him some medicine and information to prepare it for when they are gone. One of the children tells him he cured the entire village and they should thank him somehow. Nuts tells him he can ask for whatever he wants, and Milo asks him to hand over the protagonist. But the boy clearly refuses since they need the reward to buy weapons, since some monsters called fugu will come in winter and are like a kind of flying pufferfish. But just at that moment, alarms begin going off everywhere in the place, warning that the fugu have arrived. This leaves everyone in complete shock since it is the middle of summer. They immediately begin being attacked, and just as one of the monsters was carrying off a child, the protagonist appeared and split it in two. Also, the protagonist hands one of the spears to the child and tells him that if he knows how to use it, he should do honor to his father. On the other side, after saving the child, the protagonist tells Nuts his map is completely wrong since the seasonal creature locations are off. While the boy begins telling him them, we see the protagonist starts eliminating each fugu with his bow. He tells the boy that in the future, if a mushroom keeper needs help, he should clearly offer it. Right away, the protagonist jumps onto Akutagawa and asks Milo to leave. Plum at that moment tries to tell him to stay, but the boy replies it is not necessary since she has a good heart, and he knows she will help the rest of the children. So he asks her in a few words to learn medicine to be able to care for the rest. Also, we see that Nuts in the end gave one of the harpoons to the protagonist, and right at that moment Milo arrives to set off. In a scene change, we see Kurakawa is with one of his soldiers, and thinks it was a waste of time looking for the boys since one of his members had also clearly left, referring to Tyrol. At that moment, the rest of his team arrives and tells him they found nothing in the sewers. Unexpectedly, the man mentions that experienced hunters do not normally run from fights since he knows these types usually set traps for people. And we see that suddenly he pulls off one of their masks, clearly referring to the soldiers, and we see Jabai had hidden among them. So now they have discovered him. A few days later, we see both boys have arrived at a completely frozen area. They are freezing and hoping to find some camp. However, they manage to spot smoke in the distance. They also saw a kind of rabbit, and Milo, all proud, says he will hunt it to eat. However, he misses the shot and Bisco mocks him. Despite this, Milo suddenly managed to catch it, and the protagonist is stunned as Milo explains he used spider venom combined with steel mixed with explosive mushrooms. Also, the protagonist spots something strange on the ground, and after digging it out realizes it is none other than Tyrol hiding there. They take her somewhere else since the girl was freezing. Tyrol acts all arrogant, and the protagonist, very angry, tells her she should at least thank him for saving her, but the girl replies she never gives or wants any thanks. Milo asks her how she got there so fast if they were traveling at full speed. The girl mentions there was a helicopter in the temple she had repaired. However, the Shimabuki base ended up shooting it down when she was coming through the snow. Tyrol says she is tired of bad things always happening to her and calls the boys meddlers since they always show up to save her from dying. The protagonist teases her by putting a hand warmer on her forehead, and she gets furious with him. Bisco tells her that for someone who claims to want to die, she does not show a single sign of it, and thinks it would be a waste for someone like her to die in that place. The girl at that moment blushes and changes her attitude, mentioning she only wanted Milo's attention. A little while later, while the boys are crammed together on the crab, Akutagawa gets annoyed and sends them flying. Also, Milo spots what appears to be a tribe in the distance. Right away, he approaches a leader who speaks a different language. Milo barely manages to understand him, and they need to exchange coats and other things. But since they do not accept coins to roll, ends up stepping in between them since the girl speaks the tribe's language perfectly, and told the tribal leader she could give them what they need in exchange for a favor in the future. Shortly after the boys leave the place, and we see they ended up exchanging a bit of dried meat for coats and other things. And after walking for several hours, they arrive at the Kitsunosaka train station. After breaking the ice, they enter and the protagonist pulls out some glowing mushrooms, and they then venture inside and see there are several trains in the place. After investigating a bit, they realize there is one that can serve them. However, after reading a manual, they realize they must pay 300 yen. But since they do not have this type of currency to roll, arrives and begins dismantling the machine, since the girl mentions she used to be a full mechanic. She also adds that even though she was treated like a slave, she was paid very well where she worked, but many people began dying from the rust disease. After telling them a little more about her life, she asks for some time to fix the machine. This gives the boys time to prepare some food. Milo talks with the protagonist and tells him he had never known anything about what was outside his city's walls. So he confesses that if he had gone out alone, he would probably have died. And he has enjoyed the various places they have visited among other things, since he never would have imagined he would even encounter a village full of armed children. He also thinks he now sees life in a very different way, since all this time he had been sheltering in the city while other people were suffering. But despite this, the protagonist gives him some encouraging words since he tells him despite all of this, Milo was a doctor who sought to help others, and not everyone is willing to save lives like him, risking being caught by the government. The protagonist even tells him he must save Jabai since more than a master he sees him as a father figure, since practically everything the protagonist knows is thanks to him. Milo, seeing the protagonist got a bit emotional, tells him he will save Jabai just as he will save his sister. Just at that moment, Tirol arrives, having been listening to the entire conversation. The girl tells them the train is ready, and while Milo gives her food, she asks how they can risk their lives to save other people. Milo tells her it is for love, and this makes the girl blush a little. After a long while, both boys look at some books and realize they have drawings of the rust eater in them. They also discover the type of animal that carries it, and the protagonist is very happy since Jabai had only mentioned they believed where a quite large monster could be found. A few hours later, we see the boys finally board the train and it works perfectly. Tirol mentions it seems they are going on an incredible adventure, but she prefers to value her life, so she plans to stay, and the protagonist thanks her at that moment. The girl is astonished, and the protagonist tells her they now have formally introduced themselves to her and teases her, saying at least they will know her name to put on her headstone, which clearly makes her very angry. Finally, we see the train starts moving, and Milo says goodbye to the girl. As the boys continue, Milo keeps looking at a pipe snake, which is in the mushroom book, since apparently that monster is the one that carries the rust-eater mushrooms. Suddenly, we see many creatures begin coming out of the place and both start shooting at them. The protagonist fires an arrow with gas that makes them all leave, but suddenly, a giant creature appears and grabs Milo. The protagonist is much faster and manages to save him. But instead, the monster grabs the protagonist and Bisco barely manages to fire an arrow into its mouth, making many mushrooms come out of it. Milo, seeing the protagonist is being beaten, orders Akutagawa to pull out the train engine and throw it into the monster's mouth. Upon doing so, the monster releases the protagonist and Milo fires an arrow with Bisco's help, which makes the monster clearly explode. A long while later, we see both boys have finally arrived at Weeping Child Ravine, which is a gigantic cliff where they will be able to find the rust eater. Despite this, the protagonist notices some mushrooms in the place and thinks mushroom keepers must have come here 15 years ago. At that moment, a giant bird appears and carries off the monster that was chasing them. But unexpectedly, the pipe snake appears, which is practically like a giant dinosaur, since it covers the full length of the entire cliff. The protagonist fired an arrow with a rope to the other side, and after crossing tells the boy they should attack it from both sides. The protagonist begins attacking the monster, but gets nervous seeing his arrows do nothing to it. And to make the situation a bit worse, we see that at that moment, Pao comes at full speed to deal with the protagonist, since she has come determined to punish him for everything he has done to her and her brother. Clearly not knowing that Milo is actually helping the protagonist. Right away, the protagonist dodges the girl and tells her she now has better moves than the last time. The girl at that moment tells the protagonist that his time of freedom is over at this very moment. But the protagonist tells Milo he came of his own free will to help her heal with the rust eater. At that moment, the pipe snake attacks the girl, so Milo, controlling Akutagawa, launches himself toward it. They strike the snake, which frees the girl, and the protagonist manages to catch her in time. Also, just as she was about to get down, we see the snake caught them. Milo tells the crab to trust him, and we see one of its claws broke free at that moment, releasing the boy and the crab at the same time. However, suddenly, the monster turns around, and just as it was about to eat the boy, it received an impact from the protagonist's harpoon. Since at that moment, the protagonist begins teaming up with Pau just as he launches himself to save Milo. We see the monster eats them, but immediately the protagonist fires mushrooms inside it, making the creature burst from within and defeating it. At that moment, Pau hugs her brother since she cannot believe he did all of this to save her. The protagonist at that moment spots some mushrooms and thinks they are the rust eater. However, when he decides to try one, he realizes it is a completely ordinary mushroom. So Milo thinks they will have to look for another specimen the next day at this campsite. But the protagonist, a little desperate, says he will immediately go look for another since he urgently needs to cure Jabai, and Milo tries to stop him. And the protagonist ends up knocking the boy to the ground. But at that moment, Milo falls and his hand is covered in the protagonist's blood, which reacts to this. So they move to another spot, and the boy asks what kind of blood type the protagonist has, but he does not even know. And Milo wonders if mushroom keepers possess some different type, since he recalls Jabai had told him a legend about the rust eater, since these mushrooms only activate when they touch a mushroom keeper's blood. So the boy tells him he will put artificial blood in him, and when the body adapts to it, he will end up extracting some. Also, both begin arguing, and Pau realizes they are actually getting along quite well. After a long while, we see Milo begins experimenting, and Pau starts changing her opinion about mushroom keepers, since she thinks they are truly not the criminals or barbarians people believe them to be. So she thinks they might have extensive scientific knowledge that could even save humanity. However, she wonders why the bandit couple mentioned the mushroom keeper who finished off many people. The girl asks for some time to go out and repair the motorcycle. However, we see that at that moment some hooks attached to the snake, and a vessel carrying Kurakawa arrives and says they were following the protagonist and ended up finding the miraculous mushroom, since this way they could take it and he could regain his governor's position in the city. The protagonist attacks the vessel twice, but it has anti-mushroom disinfectants. So Kurakawa readies his weapon and thinks the protagonist is too dangerous, so he must do something to stop him. On the other side, they begin shooting at the protagonist, and just as he jumps, he manages to fire an arrow inside the vessel, and Kurakawa hits the protagonist with a shot and right, then leaves taking the snake at that moment, and the protagonist is completely wounded since he received a rust bullet in his stomach. And a few hours later, we see Pau heads back toward a watchman base that is nearby and right. Then we are shown what happened before she left, since the protagonist with the mushroom they had taken prepared 2 medicines. So the girl thought she would return to give the medicine to Jabai. But since the protagonist received a rust bullet impact, the girl asks Bisco to use it himself, since the rust will spread faster than he thinks. The protagonist at first refuses since they had prepared it for Jabai and her, but ends up accepting and tells her they will save both of them as soon as they return. Also, the girl tells him to remember the first fight they had and reminds the protagonist that he called her beautiful. So the girl tells him he is also handsome, and Bisco turns completely red as a tomato. Back in the present, we see the girl arrives at the base and one of her watchmen attacks her, but she is much faster and manages to finish him off. At that moment, we see Kurakawa appears with all his soldiers. Also, the girl threatens him, asking what he has done with all the watchmen in his charge, since unexpectedly they are against her. And just at that moment, we see they bring Jabai in a wheelbarrow. Back with the boys, we see Milo plays dead and just manages to catch a pig, so very excited he returns to the protagonist. And the protagonist is riding Akutagawa since he mentions the animal found a female of his species and ended up being rejected. So his companion got angry at that moment, and after throwing the protagonist through the air walked off, so he went after him and asked Milo to skin the animal. While the boy cuts the meat, he hears a television where Kurakawa is sending a message to them. At that moment we are shown what the man is showing them, but Milo is left in complete shock. And a while later the protagonist returns and realizes the boy made a very good pork stew. However, upon tasting some, he immediately realized it contained sleeping mushrooms. So he asks if something happened with Pau since he knows there is a Shimabuki base very close to the place. This leads him to see the disturbed look on Milo's face and immediately go outside and say he will go look for the girl. But Milo, as a good doctor, threatens him with the bow and tells him he cannot go anywhere since the protagonist is internally wounded, and it is far more serious than his sister's condition or Jabai's. So he tells him that since he considers him his friend, he cannot allow him to go die, since he will not find a better friend than him. The protagonist returns the words and tells him again that he knows Milo is a doctor who does the impossible to save all the people he truly treats, and he knows he will not find a better doctor or even a better friend like him. So he asks him to wait there since he plans to go and return faster than he thinks, and asks him to trust him since Milo has shown him he is an extremely strong person. Milo understands these words and thinks he would never lose against a dying person like Bisco, so he decides to attack with his bow, and the protagonist, after dodging the attack, punches him and adds that he will never be stronger than him. But unexpectedly, Milo gives him a good hit in the face. This makes the fight between them both more intense. At that moment, the protagonist manages to land a powerful blow which makes the boy fall, but at that moment he reconsiders and both end up apologizing. But Milo at that moment took advantage of the protagonist having his guard down to inject him with a sleeping agent, and tells him he knows Bisco has sacrificed so much for him. So now Milo will for the first time be the protagonist's shield since he plans to protect him no matter what happens. Shortly after, the boy takes the protagonist inside to rest and very confident thinks he must now save his sister and Jabai. In a scene change, we see Kurakawa was playing cards with someone and had injected himself with a kind of mushroom since his head and eyes look very different, not to mention he can control them himself. At that moment, we see Milo appears and threatens the man with his bow. Kurakawa at that moment tells him he was eagerly waiting for him, and at that moment Milo recalls what he had seen on the television since his sister was being beaten by the man. He also saw how Kurakawa put a hot iron on the girl's stomach. This made the boy fall to his knees seeing how his sister was being tortured, so he hears his sister telling him to run since she knows that somehow she and Jabai will escape. Also, the man showed him the antidote Milo had created and understood that he knows something about the Rust Eater. So he warned him that if he did not come within a week and reveal the secret of the mushroom, he would end up killing Pau. Back in the present, the boy asks where his sister is. The man first tells him he must tell him everything if he wants his sister freed. Milo has no choice but to yield and asks them to bring the mushrooms so he can show him. Just as they bring them, the boy begins mixing them with a liquid, so the governor thinks he expected no less from someone as intelligent as Milo. However, the boy actually set a very good trap for them since just at that moment a smoke began coming out of the mixture and covered the entire place. At that moment, Kurakawa gets nervous and feels his body gradually paralyzing, wondering when Milo learned about the numbing mushroom and all the mushroom keeper's knowledge. At that moment, we see the boy appears and Kurakawa tries to attack him, but Milo is much faster, and after dodging the attack makes several cuts with a knife, and mentions that his heart will soon stop when the poison from his knife takes effect. But unexpectedly, the boy receives an arrow in his chest, since the man had a kind of crossbow on his wrist. Also, the man injects himself with a medicine to counteract the poison the boy had given him, since Kurakawa was much more anticipatory than him. The man congratulates him for having great knowledge in all of that, and Milo, after trying to attack him, asks how on earth Kurakawa knows so much about this. And Kurakawa at that instant confesses that a long time ago he was a mushroom keeper. He also mentions that the arrow he drove into his chest has a mushroom which, if it sends certain waves, can control him like a puppet. He also tells him he is not entirely interested in the Rust Eater mushroom since the only thing that interests him about it is being able to monopolize it and get rich. Since in part Japan spends millions of rust injections treating the sick, and he knows the world currently runs on money and needs related to rust problems. And if miraculous medicines that Milo created were to emerge and save poor people, all the wealthy people living off others would end up without a cent. Milo thinks the man is a complete monster, and he mentions that if he manages to discover the secret behind all of this, he could become one of the most important people in the world. The man at that moment begins threatening the boy, seeing he does not want to tell him how to create the antidote, so he tells him he will turn him into a puppet if he refuses one last time. Milo at that moment laments to himself not being able to save his friends, but just at that moment we see there is an explosion in the wall and the protagonist appears. In a parallel scene, we see a guard is watching over Jabai's cell. The old man keeps muttering something and asks the guard he wants food, so the guard coldly gives him a rat to eat. At that moment, the phone rings and Jabai takes advantage of the guard being distracted to make a mixture with the rat and free himself, since just at that moment he appeared behind the guard. Back with the protagonist, Kurakawa tells him he plans to defeat the most powerful mushroom keeper currently around. The protagonist, in a mocking tone, tells him he has bags under his eyes from hating him so much he cannot sleep. At that moment, the man confesses that using his power as governor he was responsible for lying to everyone, since Kurakawa was responsible for claiming that mushrooms spread the rust, which actually makes the protagonist glad. At that moment we see the man tries to attack the protagonist and Bisco manages to tear off one of his limbs. However, Milo fires a rust arrow at him due to the control the man has over him. The protagonist immediately realizes Milo is being controlled by one of the mushrooms and Kurakawa is relieved it was not his healthy limb, since apparently the man had a prosthetic hand. He then begins controlling the boy and tells him to fire at the protagonist again. Milo at that moment falls into desperation and begs him not to allow him to land another hit. So the man tells him they can negotiate the secret of the Rust Eater and free him if he tells the truth. The protagonist tells him not to do it, but Milo, with tears in his eyes, tells him he just needs to mix a mushroom keeper's blood with the mushroom, and this way the medicinal effect can be activated. The man thanks him, but as expected tells him he cannot let him live since they are very dangerous and could come back to kill him, not to mention they both know too much about what he has done. At that moment, the man controls Milo and begins pointing at the protagonist's head. Right after Milo fires the arrow, but unexpectedly, the protagonist manages to catch it with his teeth. He then fires the arrow back at the man, hitting one of his eyes. Finally, Jabai appears and fires an arrow to the ground, which grows a mushroom that launches the man against the ceiling. The old man at that moment injects an antidote into Milo to counteract the controlling effect. Milo asks about his sister, and Jabai tells him not to worry since he managed to get her to safety. And right away, we see the exact moment when the old man burst in where they were holding her. After freeing her, he asked her to leave since he planned to settle some matters, clearly referring to dealing with Kurakawa. The girl listened and left at that moment, and back in the present, they managed to get out of the base. However, we see several of Kurakawa's henchmen appear at that instant and begin attacking them. Jabai tells them to flee since not even he can treat rust arrow wounds. So he asks Milo to leave and treat the protagonist since he plans to create another distraction. At that moment, Jabai begins attacking them with mushroom arrows while Milo carries the protagonist in his arms. However, at that moment, Kurakawa comes out and orders them to catch them, and they also manage to catch the old man with a net. On the other side, Milo runs at full speed, and we see he receives several rust arrow impacts on his back. Just when he could no longer take it, we see Akutagawa appeared and finished off all the guards. Right away, Milo falls to the ground and the protagonist looks very worried, but his friend only asks him not to die, which makes the protagonist get very emotional. In a scene change, we see Milo has a nightmare and just wakes up next to the protagonist. Bisco asks him not to get up since he just put several bandages on the boy's eyes. We can also see that rust has been spreading throughout both their bodies. The protagonist at that moment lies to the boy, mentioning he will give him a rust eater injection he made, since in reality this was his own which he had given to Pau. And since the boy has his eyes bandaged, he cannot verify if this is true. Right away, the protagonist injects him, and Milo asks if he is angry with him. The protagonist replies no, since if he had been in the same position, he also would have gone to Kurakawa. Finally, the protagonist tells him the most important thing is that both are alive, and they wonder if the old man is alright, since Milo adds that Jabai told his sister they had escaped. They begin a long conversation about Pau, and suddenly Milo tells the protagonist he should go out with his sister. This leaves the protagonist in complete shock since he gets very nervous, and Milo adds he thinks Bisco likes her. Not to mention he must have her at his feet since he has been dedicated to looking after what she loves most, clearly referring to Milo. Also, the boy tells him his sister even has an e-cup for him to take advantage. The protagonist tells him he surely has no experience with girls, but Milo, very confident, tells him he actually does since he has been from time to time with one of Madame's girls. So he tells him he knows his sister is one of the prettiest girls in the city, and he should not waste the fact that she likes the protagonist. They then change the subject, and Milo tells him he knows he will go looking for revenge against Kurakawa, so he will get much stronger to be able to watch the protagonist's back. Both begin an emotional conversation about what companionship means to each of them. And since Milo is afraid the protagonist will leave, Bisco tells him to rest easy since, after resting a bit, he will stay by his side. At that moment, the boy rests, and the protagonist understands at that moment what Jabai felt with him, since looking after his companion is a great responsibility, not to mention he must make sure his companion does not die. So Bisco promises himself never to allow himself to die and leave his companion behind. And a few hours later, we see the protagonist heads toward another location on Akutagawa. And in a parallel scene, we see Pau heads on her motorcycle when she spots an entire squadron of vehicles passing by. The girl at that moment wonders what on earth the secret squadron of Kurakawa is doing traveling in the direction she came from, not to mention they were in a government army vehicle. After a while, we see Kurakawa clearly brought everything to a Japanese government army base in Niiui. At that moment, we see there is a gigantic metallic elephant, and the man brings Jabai as a hostage. In the place, we can see there is a gigantic lava pit, and the man mentions he has been brewing rust, since thanks to the medicine obtained from the mushroom keepers, the patients have been decreasing. So this does not work for his business, and they will have to increase the patients if necessary. Also, Jabai is completely stunned to hear that the rust winds have not been having much effect, and it is for this reason that Kurakawa has been creating it artificially. Finally, we are revealed there is an Iron Man hanging there who was responsible in the beginning for creating this mass weapon, and that everything that happened in Japan was also his fault. Also, Kurakawa confesses he is the only Iron Man that is alive, since apparently there are others, but this is the only one that can truly move. Also among his plans is creating bullets with the iron melted with rust to fire a large cannon they have in the elephant's trunk, since this way they can spread the rust much faster. The man also mentions they should fire at the place where they found the pipe snake, since this way no more rust-eater mushrooms can grow. And Jabai finds the idea extremely outrageous and thinks he is truly a monster. But the man invites him to be part of his organization, since because Milo had said how the mushroom works, he asks him to recruit young mushroom keepers, to extract their blood, even telling him he will pay him and everything. Jabai at that moment refuses to be part of such an atrocity since he will not allow sacrifices because of this man's greed. The man tells him he has no other option since if he does not accept he will attack the mushroom keeper's village before Weeping Child Ravine. The old man at that moment hits him and tells him if he wants to fire he can do it right now. This makes Kurakawa furious and he draws his gun, but a masked man begins beating him, so the man asks him to stop at that moment since he does not want the old man to die. Also, they kneel the old man and Kurakawa warns him that if he does not accept he will cut off all his fingers, since he knows for mushroom keepers this is the most sacred thing. However, just as the masked man was about to cut his fingers, he suddenly deflects his knife and drives it into the man's feet, since we discover the masked man was actually the protagonist. After finishing off his guards, we see the protagonist throws the man near the lava pit. Bisco tells him for an old man he is quite resistant to hits. He also tells Jabai to go destroy the Ganesha cannon while he deals with Kurakawa. The old man at that instant refuses to follow this, seeing the terrible condition Bisco is in. But the boy tells him he trusts him to destroy this cannon. After saying goodbye to the old man with a hug, we see Kurakawa tells his men to bring an object not revealed to us at that moment. Also, the protagonist comes before him and Kurakawa becomes completely nervous. The man threatens the boy and tells him he will end up losing all his limbs as revenge for what he did. Also at that very instant, we see several wasps begin coming out. In a parallel scene, we see Jabai arrives outside and right then a monster appeared that attacked him. However, after dodging the attack, we see Pau arrives and with one blow sends the monster flying. The girl at that moment tells him it is time to return the favor from the previous day. Back with the protagonist, he begins fighting the wasps. However, the protagonist receives a shot in his face. Also, suddenly a monster built by Kurakawa falls and begins firing with a kind of machine gun and then charges at the protagonist. But the protagonist fires several arrows which crack the ground and breaks the floor where the monster clearly is. Also, just when the protagonist fired an arrow at Kurakawa, he realized it missed and the man began laughing, since in the attack the protagonist received from the monster, he lost his 2 fingers. This is because the rust began affecting him at that exact moment. Kurakawa, very confident that he has already won the fight, begins mocking the protagonist, but the protagonist launches himself at him and with one blow knocks him to the ground. He also tells him he does not need a bow to win a fight, so he asks him to run so he can hunt him down. since just one of his fingernails is enough to end his life. Kurikawa at that moment begins running and several of the man's soldiers try to stop the protagonist, but he finishes them off very easily, and the man panics thinking the protagonist is a complete monster. The protagonist at that moment receives several shots, but despite that continues walking toward him and punches him. However, the protagonist loses his limb from hitting him since the rust disease affected him considerably at that instant. At that moment, the protagonist knows he is completely done, and Kurikawa begins loading his gun to finish him off. Finally, the protagonist says some last words to him, and just as the man was about to shoot, we see he loses his hand from an arrow Milo fired at him. At that moment, the protagonist takes advantage and pushes the man into the lava, and Kurikawa falls on top of him. Bisco tells him he deserves to die with his own creation, and Milo comes running and tells him not to die since he had promised to always be by his side. However, the protagonist throws his bow to him and tells him he will not die since he knows he will always accompany him in spirit, so they will always be together. Finally, he tells him some encouraging words and adds that no matter what circumstances arise, he must smile. At that moment, Milo begins crying and the protagonist tells him to end his life once and for all. Also, Milo thinks he must live as Bisco did. Finally, we see the boy fires an arrow and ends the protagonist's life at that moment. Afterward, we see an alarm activates and announces the cannons are charging. On the other side, we see Pau is fighting the monsters outside the place. Both the girl and the old man notice the elephant is beginning to blow a lot of smoke and realize the cannons are getting ready to fire. This makes Pau with incredible strength grab one of the monsters and throw it at the machine, causing the weapon to fall to the ground at that moment. The old man jokingly tells her that women today are very frightening, and on the other side, we see the guards under Kurikawa begin running, while thinking the furnace at the place has gone out of control. Finally, we see they manage to destroy the cannon, and the girl goes to look for her brother. She saved him seeing some lava was about to fall on him by using a mushroom to protect her. Also at that moment, both boys come out and the old man asks where Bisco is, but the boy recalls the words the protagonist had told him and replies that he has the protagonist in his heart. At that moment, Pau and Jabai realize the boy is dead. Also, we see at that moment, the entire place collapses and Milo thinks all of Kurikawa's bad decisions have now ended. After a couple of hours, we see reinforcements came from Pau's side to check everything that was left destroyed. Milo at that moment wonders if they will be able to find the protagonist's remains. Pau tells him yes and they will possibly return him to his village. But unexpectedly, we see that just as a helicopter was passing, something hit it, and in front of them appeared a gigantic Iron Man. This leaves everyone in complete shock, since they thought the place only contained a kind of reactor cultivating rust. Suddenly, the monster fires a shot into the air which creates an explosion at Weeping Child Ravine, leaving everyone stunned since now there are no more snakes to obtain the rust eater from. Also, some attacks begin firing, but none have any effect. At that moment, the monster spits a smoke ball which begins damaging all metal objects at that moment. For a moment, Milo gets scared seeing Akutagawa was knocked down by some rubble, but Jabai tells him crabs do not rust. At that moment, Pau worries seeing they will not be able to handle the monster, and Milo, despite this, feels motivated since he tells her that since he injected the antidote, he is the only one who could go into combat. Jabai approves and says he will take care of the crab and will reach them very soon. The girl at that moment begins thinking her brother has become very brave, and in a parallel scene, we see Tirol is thinking about the farewell she had with the boys and wonders if they are still alive. At that moment, she runs into one of the mushroom-headed men Kurikawa had clearly created. The girl panics, but suddenly the mushroom heads fall off the men and they return to normal. They seem a little confused, and just at that moment, one of the government helicopters arrives. The girl hears from one of Kurikawa's secret guards that her boss and the protagonist died and informs her something very serious is about to happen. At that moment, Tirol looks at the gigantic Iron Man and is completely terrified since she had never seen anything like this. At that moment, the army tries to attack, but the Iron Man with one of its attacks finishes them all off. Tirol tells the watchmen they must do something, but the men mention Pau ordered them to wait for her orders, which makes the girl feel helpless. After a while, we see the monster was heading toward the Shimabuki village, and Milo appeared at that moment and referred to the monster as if it were Kurikawa, telling it he noticed it got a new body. Milo at that moment impersonates the protagonist to get its attention. The monster at that moment fires an attack at him, but the boy manages to dodge it. Also, we see Milo manage to hit it with some arrows which caused it a bit of damage. Milo tells it he knows mushrooms are life, and they must make them grow throughout the entire world to defeat the rust. At that moment we see the monster receives an impact from the Shimabuki people, but suddenly the monster attacks them and Jabai appears and asks the boy to attack with everything he has. So they start attacking with arrows but they grow mushrooms in its body. While the Iron Man attacks him, Milo keeps hitting with arrows causing the monster great pain. Despite this, Milo knows they need much more strength, and the monster at that moment begins roaring very loudly, and then fires an attack at the sky which falls on them creating a massive explosion. This makes the boys fall off a cliff, while the Shimabuki people watch how terrifying the monster sounds, since the group must find some way to deal with it, or it will be the end of humanity. In a parallel scene, we see the girls are in a car, and Tyrol hands Pau the Iron Man manual she had taken from Milo's base. However, both start arguing since Tyrol thinks Pau cannot understand the guide. Tyrol tells her she cannot believe she is Milo's sister, but Pau equally tells her she would never believe a traveling salesgirl is her brother's friend. Back with Milo, we see they manage to save themselves, and Milo notices the old man has his foot wounded. While the boy treats the wound, the old man thinks the monster possesses certain qualities from people of the past, since the monster has the ability to rust practically anything it wants. And Jabai is beginning to believe the rust is something that goes beyond borders and can completely destroy humanity, since it is a power that is beyond everyone's level, almost as if it were a kind of god. Milo tells him if it were a god it would be the god of death, so the Rust Eater in this case would be the complete opposite since it surpasses it by far. At that moment we see the Shimabuki people arrive, and Milo asks the old man to rest due to his wound. The old man tells him he does not know where the monster is heading, but the boy tells him he does know, since after looking it in the eyes it will return home, which is Imahama. At that moment, we see Milo says goodbye and begins leaving with Akutagawa. On the other side, the Shimabuki people try to attack the monster, but it launches a powerful attack. Shortly after we see the village children begin preparing since they spotted the Iron Man. Nuts at that moment gets nervous since he had never seen or heard of anything like this. But one of the children mentions the monster has the structures of the city. The children enter a brief discussion about whether to escape or try to defend the village, but one of them mentions the souls of their ancestors are actually within them. So they think the best thing will be to leave and afterward they can rebuild the village. At that moment Nuts orders them to leave and we see the monster attacks the statue they had in the village. Also the monster looks at the children and just as it was about to chase them, it managed to step on several explosive traps. The boy bravely tells them to leave since he will stay distracting the monster so they can escape, but his companions at first refuse to leave him alone. But Nuts says some last words and right away throws himself to get the monster's attention, thinking he will use the strength his ancestors had to distract the monster. The children at that moment begin leaving, and Nuts throws his spear at the monster, but it has no effect since the boy is very weak. The monster notices his presence, so Nuts begins running at full speed while the monster charges a powerful ray. Just as he was about to be hit, we see a mushroom grew in the place and protected the child. At that moment Milo appeared and challenges the monster saying since it could not handle him it stooped to fighting children. At that moment we see Milo behaves in a quite different way, as if his soul had fused with the protagonists. Just at that moment, without thinking twice the combat between both begins. Milo at that moment begins hitting the Iron Man with several arrows. Also the boy congratulates Nuts for having demonstrated the strength he shared with his father. Also Milo asks them to leave immediately so none of them die since Milo clearly worries about all of them. Right away the boys reach Nuts and tell them to leave. And on the other side Milo fires an arrow which grows a mushroom that makes him rise up. He manages to hit it with an arrow in its head while the children run. They ask why he has not come with the protagonist. On the other side Milo calls Akutagawa, and after dodging several rays the monster fired at him, we see Pau appears and hits it in the head. Also Tyrol and Jabai appeared at the location. At that very instant Pau tells them they must be on alert since the armed watchmen are coming. At that moment, a massive bombardment begins against the Iron Man, but this seems to have no effect on it whatsoever since it only ignores them and begins leaving the place, so everyone immediately starts following it. On the other side, we see the girls with Madame think everything has been very quiet in the city since they comment the watchman went somewhere else. However, at that moment, a girl arrives, and after turning on the TV shows them the giant creature. Back in the combat, we see after attacking several times, the monster began opening its stomach to carry out an attack. Several aircraft coming toward the monster received an attack which the rust consumed in just 1 second, making them fall and leaving everyone completely nervous. Also, the monster with its powerful ray begins creating a kind of rust cloud storm that oxidizes everything in its path, and they were saved thanks to Akutagawa's resistant shell. Upon seeing everyone is in perfect condition, Milo tries to inject himself with one of the mushrooms, and Jabai stops him immediately, but the boy tells him if he were the protagonist he would probably let him use it. So he asks Jabai before leaving to take care of his sister. While the boy heads at full speed to catch up with the monster, we see it is beginning to approach the city. It immediately begins being bombarded by the city's defenses, but as expected, none of its attackers can damage it. At that moment, Milo appears and tells it to remember he is its true opponent, so he wants it to focus on only attacking him. Since there were television cameras recording, we see everyone in the city is astonished to see the boy is facing the monster alone, since they only knew him as a very calm doctor who helped people with their rust diseases. Right after we see the monster begins attacking Milo, and after dodging its attacks, the boy equally counterattacks. However, at that moment, the boy jumps along with the crab to attack, and unexpectedly the Iron Man hits him with its hand. This leaves the boy slightly wounded, and we see that simultaneously Tyrol and Jabai head to the location at maximum speed along with Pau. While Milo continues attacking the monster, he feels very exhausted and wonders if this is how Bisco felt in combat. Finally, we see the boy create several mushrooms to jump off and manages to land on top of the monster. At that instant, Milo begins stabbing the Iron Man and causes it an enormous amount of damage. Also, everyone is astonished to see the monster stopped at that moment. Milo notices there is something in the monster's body, and after pulling it out realizes it was his friend's glasses, so he begins crying, and just then the monster reacts again and throws Milo against the city wall. Pau at that moment is stunned by the hit her brother received. Also, suddenly, we see a hand begins coming out of the crack that was made in the monster. Unexpectedly, the protagonist comes out of it and heads toward Milo while telling him he heard his voice from hell itself, since now the protagonist has been reborn as a kind of god, and his body has even completely regenerated. He finally took the glasses Milo had pulled from the monster and got ready to fight against the Iron Man, leaving tears in his friend Milo's eyes upon seeing that Bisco had not actually died. We are then shown what happened a few minutes earlier, since the protagonist was in a kind of trance inside the monster's stomach while hearing his friend's voice. Back in the present, we see the monster begins charging a powerful blow to hit Milo. But just at that moment, the protagonist appeared and with a single attack ended up cutting off one of its limbs. And it was right there that he reached Milo and ended up extending his hand to fight together against the monster. At that moment, the protagonist receives an arm from his friend, but tells him his body radiates a lot of heat which burns. Also, we see the protagonist's hand now seems to glow a little. Just at that moment, the monster hits where they are, and after dodging the attack, Milo hands him his bow and he attacks it with arrows. Pau at that moment is stunned, since rust-eater mushrooms in their final form begin appearing. Even Jabai mentions the protagonist has returned transformed into a mushroom god, and right away the monster tries to attack him again, and the protagonist fires one of his arrows on behalf of both of them at the monster. Even Bisco is stunned to see that any arrow he fires turns into a rust-eater, and despite the protagonist splitting the monster in two, we see it unfortunately continues to live. So Milo tells him he will accompany him in combat. While both run toward the place, Milo tells him it seems the protagonist is now a kind of hybrid between rust-eater and human. So it could be said the protagonist now has the power to counteract rust directly with his arrows, and explains that it was possibly when he ate the mushroom taken from the snake, since when it mixed with his blood, the organism adopted that new form. Right after, just as Bisco was about to fire at the monster to finish it off, he realized it had swollen up. At that moment, Tyrol arrived with them and told the protagonist not to fire at it, since if he does, he could create a hole pointing toward the city and could destroy everything. So he will have to plan something so it does not affect the city of Imahama. At that moment, the monster begins preparing its corrosive attack, and just then the protagonist created rust-eater mushrooms in front of it, creating a protective barrier that stopped the attack. Everyone is astonished by the protagonist's power, and he mentions he only uses a tiny amount, but does not understand why the rust-eaters come out in such large quantities. While the Iron Man keeps attacking the mushrooms, everyone gets nervous knowing they must do something. Tyrol at that moment checks the guide, and after a long search realizes its body is controlled by the metal piece in its head. Since if they manage to destroy this part, the robot will not enter any self-destruction phase or anything like that. This motivates the protagonist, and he says if that is the case, they just need to blow its head off with an arrow. Also, Pau tells him her rod can break the armor without the need to provoke the monster. The protagonist mocks her, saying he thought she used it to beat people up, just as she tried with him. The girl tells him he should not say these things since she plans to risk her life for them. Upon seeing the girl keeps looking at him and mentions she will wait for a reward, the protagonist gets very nervous and tells her after winning he will give her whatever she wants. The girl stays thinking about what she just heard and approached him and ended up giving him an enormous kiss, leaving everyone surprised at that moment. After doing so, she tells him she is taking the protagonist in advance as her reward for the combat. This clearly causes Milo to tease him at that moment, and then Tyrol tells them her objective has been fulfilled by returning the 2 favors she owed. Milo at that moment asks why she helped them beyond that, and the girl blushes and tells him that is what a friend would do. And after saying these words, she leaves at full speed. Afterward, we see everyone gets ready to fight, and Pau uses her rod alongside Jabai on the crab. At that moment, the girl jumps and manages to land a hit on the metal helmet. However, she receives a hit, and the protagonist takes advantage to land an arrow into the helmet, which makes it break in two. The protagonist gets very excited knowing the girl's plan is working. Also, we can see on its head that Kurakawa is fused to the monster. The protagonist immediately attacks him, but we see he carries out a multiple attack against all of them. Milo managed to defend his sister, and with a mushroom, the protagonist praised him for his great improvement with the bow. At that moment, Kurakawa tells him he will finish them all off if the protagonist manages to create a mushroom that elevates them high up. And just as he was about to land the final blow, we see the man filled the protagonist's eyes with blood. So since the protagonist cannot see very well, Milo helps him, as the protagonist had once done for him. And after saying some words to Bisco, clearly Milo tells him to trust him. And after releasing his arrow, we see it pierce through the man's head, making a row of rust-eater mushrooms begin heading toward the monster, until it finally fills it completely and also finishes off Kurakawa. At that moment, everyone waits to see what happened, and Pau realizes the rust on her body has now completely disappeared. This is thanks to the kiss the protagonist had clearly given her. Also, Jabai wonders why the boys are not coming down from the mushroom, and Pau replies he should leave them since they must be talking. Right away, we see Milo tells the protagonist they only wanted to save 2 people and ended up with hundreds of rust-eater mushrooms. Since there are even so many mushrooms, they will possibly save all the people of Japan. The protagonist arrogantly says it was thanks to his god power, but Milo replies he is just clumsy. Also, we see he hugs the protagonist at that moment and asks him to never leave him again since he does not know how much he suffered all that time without him. After several minutes talking, we see the boys return to the others, and even Tyrol ended up stealing several mushrooms. On the other side, we see that some time later Milo opened a provisional panda clinic to treat the rest of the people with the medicine he has. Even the city children had a happy ending since their parents who had been serving Kurakawa ended up returning to them at the village. Several days later, we see Anasage is watching the news, and we discover Pau was made governor. At that moment, we see 2 mysterious men arrived at the place. The man asks him if it seems strange to see the posters of the protagonist and now Milo too. Also, we can notice both men are the protagonist and Milo in disguise. The child thinks Milo has the face of someone who eats his patients since they were clearly nicknamed cannibals. The protagonist at that moment could not hold it anymore and ended up laughing. And after handing over their cards, we see the man begins opening the door, clearly the border gate, and just then the protagonist turns back and hands him 2 rust-eater mushroom injections. The man goes crazy thinking they are very valuable and says he does not plan to accept bribes. However, the protagonist tells him he knows he has been putting fertilizer on the mushroom he created the first time he escaped with them, so at that moment the man realizes they are Bisco and Milo. So they start chasing them and they mount Akutagawa and leave at maximum speed. However, Milo, seeing the child has a camera, ends up posing for his photo. And finally, both continue talking, and the protagonist thinks they will go to the rest of the rust-filled places to plant mushrooms and cure all the areas. And that is how this anime ends.